For all that celebrations are magnificent, at the heart of the pageantry is a simple message: service.
No royal proclamation was made. There was no announcement of abdication, no lowered flags, no ringing bells, and no crowds gathering outside Buckingham Palace. But behind the privacy of a single closed door, King Charles made a choice that quietly reshaped the future of the monarchy. His voice had lost much of its strength, yet his resolve was unmistakable as he instructed Prince William to begin preparing for the throne without delay. What drove the king to step back was not simply fatigue. The real reason was a betrayal that had taken root within his own household. But that's only part of the story. Before we uncover what this decision truly means for the royal family, be sure to subscribe to Hollywood Today so you never miss an important update. William received the message before the morning had properly begun. He was instructed to come to Clarence House alone, without Catherine, without aides, and without the usual ceremonial staff. The King's London residence was known for its calm routines and careful order, yet this summons carried an urgency that left no room for hesitation. When the prince entered the study, he found Charles seated beside a closed dispatch box, the secure case used for transporting official government documents. The king looked visibly exhausted. He offered nothing more than a quiet request for William to take a seat. Then Charles spoke with startling honesty. After discovering that a senior palace advisor had hidden critical medical warnings, allowing his schedule to become dangerously overwhelming, he had decided to step back from several public engagements and constitutional duties. Constitutional duties are the sovereign's official responsibilities within the government. More surprising still, Charles instructed William to begin immediate preparations for expanded royal authority, including confidential briefings and high-level meetings that had always been intended for a much later stage of his life. William did not respond as the heir to the throne. He responded as a worried son. Leaning forward, he quietly asked whether his father was seriously ill. Charles paused. That silence carried more weight than any diagnosis ever could. William urged him to cancel every upcoming engagement, but the suggestion only deepened the king's frustration. Charles insisted he was not abandoning the crown. Even so, his hand shook noticeably as he slid the upcoming schedule across the desk. Then, the truth emerged. Medical advice had been softened, omitted, and quietly removed from official briefing folders for weeks. Someone responsible for managing the royal diary had knowingly allowed the king to continue an exhausting workload despite understanding the risks. And that was not the most shocking revelation. The transition had already begun. Secure meetings, constitutional papers, and private sessions with senior officials had already been organized under William's name before he had even entered the room. William rose slowly, carrying the full weight of a reality that had changed in a matter of minutes. As he reached the door, Charles finally revealed the identity of the person who had approved the concealed changes to his schedule. The prince stopped instantly, his hand still resting on the door handle. He had walked into Clarence House believing he had been called there to help his father. He walked out realizing he had been summoned to protect the crown from someone who was already inside it. For most of his life, William had lived with the certainty that one day the crown would become his responsibility. But that day had always seemed far away, safely separated from the present by his father's reign. Now, without ceremony or warning, that distant future had arrived. Charles remained king, yet William was already being forced to think like the monarch who could soon succeed him. Standing between father and son was far more than duty. There was fear, years of unfinished history, and a painful truth neither of them wanted to acknowledge. This is where everything began to change. After leaving Clarence House, William remained alone inside the car long after it had stopped. A message from Catherine waited on his phone, asking if everything was all right, but he struggled to decide how much he could tell her. Every new responsibility placed upon him would reach far beyond himself. It would reshape Catherine's life, influence George's understanding of his own future, and draw Charlotte and Louis even closer to a royal world their parents had worked so carefully to keep at a distance. The moment William returned home, Catherine sensed that something had changed. He quietly placed his phone face down and stayed standing, as though sitting would make the truth impossible to escape. She gently asked what had happened. His carefully controlled expression held together for only a brief moment before it finally gave way. William told her that Charles was not simply reducing his public appearances. The king would also hand over several strategic meetings, overseas preparations, and the weekly briefings that had always gone directly to the sovereign, the reigning monarch who holds the crown's formal authority. For Charles, the same transition felt entirely different. Service had shaped nearly every decade of his life, and endurance had become the measure by which he judged himself. Stepping back did not feel like a chance to rest. It felt as though time had overtaken him before he was prepared to let go. When Camilla discovered that the private meeting had taken place without her knowledge, the queen consort sat alone after Charles closed the study door. Embarrassment quickly gave way to anger, and that anger slowly turned into fear. William's growing authority threatened to leave her standing beside the king while possessing less influence than ever before. As Catherine listened, William carefully explained just how extensive the transition would be. Then another development arrived. A royal courier delivered a sealed timetable outlining 6 weeks of constitutional preparation. Constitutional preparation referred to the confidential briefings and official training given to someone expected to assume greater royal responsibility. What happened next would make it clear that this transition was moving much faster than anyone outside those palace walls had imagined. William unfolded the timetable with deliberate care. The very first page listed meetings he had never imagined attending until many years from now. As his eyes moved across the document, Catherine noticed something he had overlooked. One approval line remained unsigned, and the missing signature belonged to the very advisor accused of concealing the king's medical warnings. The silence that followed felt heavier than either of them expected. Before William could prepare himself for the responsibilities of the crown, he first had to uncover why his father had been driven beyond his limits. The answer led him back to one evening neither of them would ever forget. The conversation at Clarence House had not begun there. Its roots stretched back several weeks to a glittering state banquet filled with elegant music, formal speeches, and carefully rehearsed smiles. Behind that polished display, however, King Charles experienced a frightening moment that only a select few truly understood. The applause never stopped, but the king could no longer concentrate on the words before him. William noticed his father tightening his grip on the table. Camilla watched the color drain from his face, and one senior palace advisor quietly ensured the evening continued as if nothing had happened. By then, Charles had been carrying an impossible workload for far too long. His royal diary had become increasingly crowded as postponed engagements, diplomatic commitments, and ceremonial appearances were packed into weeks that were already overflowing. The royal diary is the official schedule that governs both the monarch's public appearances and private responsibilities. Medical advisors had repeatedly urged him to allow himself longer periods of recovery. Instead, the gaps between engagements kept disappearing. William had questioned the relentless pace more than once, but each time his father brushed aside those concerns, convinced his son was simply becoming too protective. William could still remember his father's reply. Charles insisted that duty was never measured by personal comfort. The prince had wanted to press the issue further. Instead, he chose silence, unwilling to make his father feel fragile or constantly monitored. Later, that decision would weigh heavily on him. When Charles stood to deliver his address at the Commonwealth Unity Banquet, he sensed almost immediately that something was wrong. The banquet was a formal royal dinner attended by representatives from Commonwealth nations, created to demonstrate unity and the leadership of the monarchy. Halfway through the speech, the words suddenly slipped away. He lost his place. A wave of dizziness swept over him, forcing him to grip the edge of the table for support. William instinctively stepped forward. Camilla froze where she stood. But before either of them could act, the senior advisor discreetly signaled the orchestra to continue playing. Leaning close, the official quietly reminded Charles that foreign delegates were watching. Stopping now, he warned, could trigger unnecessary panic. Determined to finish, the king forced himself through the remaining lines. William watched with growing anger. Camilla remained caught between personal concern and royal protocol. When the applause finally filled the room, none of them heard it as a celebration. Behind closed doors, Charles immediately confronted the advisor in a private side room. His first question was direct. Why had no emergency pause been ordered? The official answered without hesitation. Maintaining the appearance of stability, he insisted, had been the highest priority. At that moment, something changed in the king. He realized someone had chosen protecting headlines over protecting his health. Not long afterward, Charles uncovered a documented medical report revealing that his physician had advised him to withdraw from the banquet that very morning. The warning had never reached him. It had never reached William. It had never reached the senior private secretary, the chief official responsible for coordinating the sovereign's work. Then another revelation followed. A palace staff member admitted in a recorded internal statement that the doctor's written recommendation had been removed from the king's red box, the secure case used to carry official papers, and replaced with a shortened verbal summary describing his condition as manageable. Only someone with significant operational authority could have authorized such a decision. William carefully reconstructed the timeline. Then he requested a private meeting with the advisor at the center of the controversy. No lawyers, no secretaries, no palace intermediaries. The crisis had begun with one concealed medical warning. But what happened next threatened to expose something far larger. When the advisor entered the room, William remained perfectly calm. He never needed to raise his voice. The door quietly closed behind them. The chair remained intentionally untouched. Without saying a word, the prince placed the altered schedule on the table between them. Several long seconds passed in complete silence. Then William broke it with a single question. Who authorized hiding the king's medical warning? The answer did far more than reveal a failure inside the palace. It exposed just how far certain individuals had gone to control the public image of Charles's reign. The advisor had managed access to the king's diary, organized public engagements, and filtered urgent recommendations before they ever reached the sovereign. That responsibility carried enormous power. The royal diary was far more than a calendar. It determined where the monarch appeared, how long he worked, and which concerns reached him before every official duty. William understood that confronting this one man also meant confronting the system that had quietly grown around his father. One by one, the prince laid the documents across the table. First came the original medical recommendation. Next, the shortened summary. Finally, the banquet schedule. Each document told a different version of the same day. Together, they proved beyond doubt that someone had altered the truth before it ever reached King Charles. William looked directly at the advisor. Had preserving the monarchy's image become more important than protecting the monarch himself? The official showed no sign of regret. Charles had demanded continuity, he replied, and the royal household had simply carried out the sovereign's wishes. William stepped closer. His voice remained controlled, but every word carried unmistakable weight. He accused the advisor of exploiting his father's lifelong devotion to duty, fully aware that Charles would never stop working if the true level of danger was kept hidden. What happened next would determine whether the palace had merely failed its king or deliberately betrayed him. The advisor refused to back down. Instead, he turned the conversation back on William. He reminded the prince that he himself had scaled back parts of his own schedule in the past and argued that someone who had never carried the full burden of the crown could not truly understand the pressure placed upon a reigning monarch. The words hit their target. William's jaw tightened, but he offered no defense. Instead, he pointed once again to the concealed medical warning and calmly demanded the names of everyone involved. After a long pause, the official finally admitted during the recorded internal conversation that he had not acted alone. Another senior royal office had supported keeping the banquet exactly as planned, believing that canceling it could spark public doubts about Charles's ability to continue ruling. Then came the revelation that changed everything. Camilla had been informed that the king had been advised to rest, but she had never been shown the complete medical report. William said nothing. The queen consort might have been deliberately misled. She might have accepted what she was told without asking further questions. Or perhaps she knew more than she would later acknowledge. The uncertainty only made the betrayal more dangerous. Without asking another question, William brought the meeting to an end. He immediately revoked the advisor's access to the king's schedule and instructed him to surrender his palace security pass before leaving. The confrontation inside that room was over. William had prevailed, but removing a single official could never answer the far greater question: who truly possessed the authority to reshape the reign of a living king? A crown rests upon one person's head. Yet a monarchy moves through signatures, confidential briefings, official permissions, and traditions that have been protected for generations. William could shield his father behind closed doors. What he could not do was simply assume royal authority because he believed it was necessary. Every move had to be exact. One wrong step could make him appear disloyal. One moment of hesitation could leave Charles vulnerable all over again. And while constitutional advisors gathered behind closed doors, the king found himself listening as others quietly debated how much responsibility he could safely continue to carry. William immediately understood the limits before him. As heir to the throne, he could accept additional engagements and receive more sensitive briefings. But Charles remained the sovereign, the reigning monarch who continued to hold the crown's formal authority. Any transfer of constitutional functions, the official responsibilities directly tied to the head of state, required the king's approval and a series of established legal procedures that made every decision deliberate, cautious, and emotionally painful. Charles sat through a private consultation while senior advisors carefully listed the responsibilities they believed he should surrender. An overseas visit was removed first, then portions of ceremonial planning. Selected government meetings followed. After that came parts of the weekly royal program. Every recommendation was presented as an act of protection. But the king heard something entirely different. With each sentence, it sounded as though his reign was being reduced piece by piece. When one advisor proposed canceling a tour Charles had spent months preparing for, the king quietly removed his glasses. Looking around the room, he asked a question no one seemed ready to answer. Did anyone there still believe he was capable? Silence filled the room. Before anyone else could speak, William answered. His father was not being replaced. He was delegating responsibilities, temporarily assigning duties while retaining final authority. The prince rejected every document that described the process as removal. He insisted the transition must protect Charles's dignity, because safeguarding the monarch's health should never come at the cost of humiliating the man himself. William would prepare for the day he inherited the crown, but he refused to build that future upon his father's public decline. Then the situation became even more troubling. William discovered a sealed collection of contingency papers. They outlined the framework for a temporary regency, a legal arrangement allowing another member of the royal family to carry out the sovereign's duties if the monarch became incapable of acting. The papers had been drafted before Charles ever learned that his medical warnings had been concealed. Someone had anticipated the possibility of a sudden collapse, yet still allowed the demanding schedule to continue. That realization changed everything. After the advisors departed, Charles remained alone with William. Quietly, the king signed an order granting his son access to confidential briefings and expanded authority over the royal program. When he finished, he lowered the pen. But his hand stayed resting on the page. For a long, silent moment, it seemed as though the monarch was holding on to the very part of himself he had just begun to surrender. The effects spread through the palace almost immediately. Camilla soon learned that several members of her household would now report directly to William's office. She understood exactly what that meant. The transition had been presented as a way to protect Charles. But once the prince's authority extended into her own staff, protection began to resemble something far more unsettling: a quiet transfer of power. By the following morning, the atmosphere inside the palace had unmistakably changed. Officials who had once waited for instructions from the king's household were now including William's office in every significant decision. Engagements quietly disappeared from calendars. Meetings were reassigned. Doors that had always opened without question for Camilla's aides suddenly required approval before anyone could enter. No public announcement had been made. Yet everyone inside those walls understood what was happening. Authority was shifting. For Charles, that silent change brought a measure of relief. For Camilla, it felt like a warning that her influence might shrink alongside the king's. William wasted no time. He canceled several demanding appearances, revised travel plans, and ordered that every piece of medical advice be delivered directly to Charles without passing through scheduling officials. For years, the royal household, the network of staff responsible for managing the monarch's official duties and private affairs, had relied on long chains of approval. William shortened those chains immediately. Every delay had become a risk. Every decision now required written accountability. But even those changes could not prevent the next discovery, one that threatened to reveal an even deeper struggle for control inside the palace. William wanted complete answers, not assumptions, not summaries. He demanded names, exact times, and clear explanations for every decision that had been made. It did not take long for palace staff to realize that the future king was doing far more than supporting his father. He was learning to oversee the royal household with a level of control it had not experienced in years. To some, that brought reassurance. To others, it felt like constant scrutiny. Camilla experienced that shift firsthand when an aide placed a revised schedule in front of her. A reception she had expected to host had quietly been reassigned to William and Catherine. She read the document once, then again. Setting it firmly on the table, the queen consort demanded to know why she had learned of the change from palace staff instead of from her own husband. Charles met her frustration without backing away. Calmly, the king admitted that the decision had been his. Camilla asked whether William had now begun deciding who stood beside the monarch. Charles answered with painful honesty. His son, he said, was making the decisions that would keep him alive and able to continue serving. Those words cut deeply because they carried a truth she could not easily dismiss. But that was only part of what was unfolding. Only hours later, the crisis took another unexpected turn. Palace security uncovered altered schedules and private correspondence stored outside the approved archive, the official system responsible for preserving royal records. The dismissed advisor had been assembling a separate collection of documents designed to suggest that Charles had willingly accepted every risk placed before him. Someone had prepared a defense before the full truth ever came to light. Then another discovery raised even more troubling questions. William received a recovered message originating from Camilla's household. It asked whether canceling the banquet would make the queen appear incapable of supporting the king. The message did not prove she had ordered anything, but it moved suspicion uncomfortably close to her office. William could no longer tell where genuine concern ended and where personal ambition began. Watching the situation unfold, Charles realized his own family was beginning to divide around him. Exhausted by the growing tension, the king summoned William for another private meeting. This time, Catherine was excluded. So was Camilla. No advisors entered. No security officers remained. The machinery of power had quietly separated the palace into competing sides. But the decision that mattered most would belong to neither officials nor advisors. It would belong to a father and his son. For the first time since the crisis began, Charles and William faced each other without documents spread across the table. No private secretary stood nearby. No advisors waited silently along the walls. Charles remained beside the window. William paused near the doorway, almost uncertain whether he had entered the room as a son or as the future king. Then Charles spoke the words William never expected to hear. "I know you're ready." It was not an abdication. It was something far more personal. A father finally releasing his son from years of uncertainty. Before the meeting began, Charles had instructed every member of staff to leave. Even the private secretary, the senior official responsible for managing the monarch's daily work and official records, had been told that no formal note would be kept. The king wanted this conversation to belong only to them, not to an archive, not to a legal record, not to history's official version of his reign. William slowly stepped forward. He admitted that preparing for the throne did not feel like an achievement. Instead, it felt like watching a door quietly close behind the man who had raised him. For years, he had understood that one day, the crown would become his responsibility. but he had never imagined that day arriving through fear. Charles answered softly. Stepping back, he confessed, had frightened him more than anyone realized. After waiting a lifetime to become king, he feared becoming irrelevant to the very institution he had dedicated his life to serving. His voice began with confidence, then it faltered. More than anything, he did not want William to remember him as a monarch who needed rescuing from the people inside his own household. William responded with equal honesty. The anger he had directed toward the advisor, he admitted, had also been directed at his father. He could no longer accept the idea that duty excused every sacrifice. Service demanded commitment, but it should never demand self-destruction. Even a sovereign, he said, had to recognize human limits. Then Charles revealed the full truth during their private recorded conversation. The betrayal had forced him to step back because it proved he could no longer trust the system surrounding him to protect the truth. Until the royal household, the network of staff responsible for managing the monarch's official work, could be rebuilt, William would become the safeguard standing between the king and those who controlled access to his reign. Then Charles reached into his pocket. He removed a small key. It unlocked a private briefing cabinet containing highly sensitive royal and government documents. Placing it into William's hand, the king gently closed his son's fingers around it. Access, he said quietly, was never a reward for power. It was a responsibility to question everyone, including the king himself. William offered no celebration, no smile. He simply nodded. A few moments later, the door opened. William did not step out first. Instead, he waited. Father and son left the room side by side. Their reconciliation had ended the conflict between them. But beyond the palace walls, another story was already unfolding. The hidden transition was beginning to grow into a royal earthquake watched across the world. The palace tried to present every change as little more than routine adjustments. The public, however, sensed something much larger. William increasingly appeared at events where Charles had once been expected. Government officials began speaking to him with a new level of authority and respect. And standing beside him through it all was Catherine, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of a future queen. The next chapter would make it impossible for anyone to believe these changes were merely temporary. Then one newspaper headline said what every official statement carefully avoided. A photograph showed William entering Buckingham Palace beneath the words, "The king steps back, the heir steps forward." Across Britain, the message needed no explanation. Buckingham Palace later confirmed in an official written statement that King Charles would reduce his public program while Prince William assumed a larger share of ceremonial and strategic responsibilities. A public program is the schedule of engagements carried out in the monarch's name. The statement emphasized continuity and carefully rejected any suggestion of abdication. But no carefully chosen wording could conceal how significant the shift had become. Soon afterward, William led a national service his father had originally been expected to attend. Although he carried a message from the king, he did not imitate Charles or rely on his father's words. Instead, he spoke with quiet confidence and steady conviction, giving the public its clearest glimpse yet of how the future king might one day lead. Catherine stood beside him, calm and composed as always. Yet she understood what many others did not. Every successful appearance by William also reflected how much Charles had been forced to surrender. From a private sitting room, the king watched the coverage unfold. Outside Buckingham Palace, supporters gathered carrying handwritten messages, wishing him strength and recovery. Then something happened that touched him deeply. As the crowd began singing the national anthem, Charles lowered his eyes. A young boy lifted a handmade sign that read, "Rest, Your Majesty, we will wait." The king quietly covered his mouth with one hand. Softly, almost to himself, he thanked the public. Only Camilla, standing close beside him, heard those words. But while sympathy surrounded Charles, Camilla faced a very different reception. During one of her own engagements, questions were shouted from the crowd. Had her household known more about the hidden medical warning than it admitted? Why had no one spoken sooner? The queen consort continued walking without responding. Later, inside her vehicle, she slowly removed her gloves and stared silently through the window. She understood what had changed. Public compassion had gathered around the king. Public suspicion had begun gathering around her. Meanwhile, William's growing role became impossible to ignore. During a special evening television broadcast, One presenter summarized the moment with a single sentence. For the first time, Britain was not simply watching the prince represent the crown. It was watching him protect the sovereign who still wore it. The words spread quickly because they captured the truth more clearly than any palace statement had dared to express. When Charles heard that broadcast, he reached a decision. Encouraged by William's performance and deeply moved by the public's response, the king prepared a personal recorded address to the nation. It would be his opportunity to end the speculation, define his son's new responsibilities, and address the betrayal that had forced this extraordinary transition. The public had responded with compassion instead of panic. Now Charles had one final responsibility. He needed to explain why stepping back had not weakened the monarchy, but had helped preserve it. When the king finally addressed the nation, he did not sound like a defeated ruler. He spoke as a sovereign, as a father, and as a man who had learned the painful cost of placing trust in the wrong people. He confirmed that William would continue carrying greater responsibility while he recovered, and while the royal household was rebuilt around principles of accountability. Then he made one point unmistakably clear. Stepping back was never an escape from duty. It was a choice made so that duty could never again be used against the person carrying it. Charles also confirmed in the recorded address that he remained the sovereign and would continue performing essential constitutional work. Constitutional work refers to the monarch's formal responsibilities as head of state, including government briefings and official approvals. William would continue taking on expanded public, ceremonial, and strategic responsibilities while his father recovered. This was not an abdication. It was a carefully managed redistribution of responsibility, designed to protect the king without removing his constitutional authority. Charles also announced that permanent changes had been made within the palace. The advisor responsible for suppressing the medical warning had been dismissed. Future medical communications would reach the monarch directly without passing through scheduling officials. William had also been given a formal role in reviewing the royal program, ensuring that no one could ever again conceal danger behind the demands of duty. Then the king paused. It was the most personal moment of his entire address. Charles admitted that a lifetime of service also required the honesty to recognize human limits. He neither concealed his weakness nor apologized for accepting protection. Instead, he transformed vulnerability into an act of responsibility. That brief silence spoke almost louder than his words. It showed a monarch choosing honesty over the illusion of endless strength. Watching beside Catherine, William showed no sign of celebration. When his father expressed complete confidence in him, the prince quietly lowered his head. Catherine remained close at his side, knowing that every new responsibility William accepted had come at the cost of Charles's suffering. The future king had gained greater authority, but he carried it with humility, not triumph. Later, during a private recorded conversation, Charles also settled Camilla's future role. The queen consort would continue standing beside the king. However, her household would no longer operate outside William's oversight. She accepted the decision, understanding that protecting influence could never again come before protecting the monarch himself. Charles had stepped back because hidden medical warnings had shattered his trust in the system surrounding the throne. By empowering William, he created something stronger than protocol alone, a son willing to question his father, because saving him mattered more than agreeing with him. The crown had not yet passed from father to son, but trust had, responsibility had, and so had the king's blessing. Charles remained the king, William proved he was ready, and the monarchy endured because, when it mattered most, both father and son chose truth over pride. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next update. We'll see you in the next one.